We've all been there, right? A critical revenue system breaks, and the first instinct is always to blame execution, to scramble for a fix. But that never really solves the underlying problem, because the problem isn't where we think it is. So let's just start with a pretty provocative idea. Revenue doesn't actually break at scale. The issues that we're all fighting aren't really about volume or complexity. That's a symptom, not the cause. No, it breaks at very specific, critical moments of choice. These are the points that constrain everything that comes after. The real vulnerability isn't in the work itself, it's in the decision that came before the work. And here's the real issue. Most of the time, these critical decision points are completely invisible. They're buried, they're assumed, but they're not explicit. We call these decision surfaces. And if you want a resilient revenue system, you have to understand them. So, what exactly is a decision surface? It's important to be clear. We're not talking about a dashboard or a meeting or a process document. We're talking about a structural concept. Put simply, a decision surface is the specific place where a choice is made that permanently, and I mean permanently, constrains how revenue can behave in the future. Think of it like the architectural blueprint for everything that follows. And these surfaces have three key properties you have to recognize. First, they're recurrent. These aren't one-and-done choices. They are foundational questions the system has to answer again and again. Second, they're irreversible. Once that choice is made, it boxes you in. And third, they have longevity. The decision itself sticks around long after any single action is taken. Now, this brings us to a really fundamental shift in how we need to think about our work. And it's this: execution is downstream. You know, the common view is pretty simple. Better execution leads to better outcomes. But the structural reality is a lot different. The decision surface comes first. It sets the constraints. It dictates the behavior that execution is allowed to have. And that behavior produces the outcome. In other words, execution just inherits the limits that were set way upstream. And this leads to a really crucial insight. Execution doesn't decide the outcome. It merely expresses the outcome that was already baked in by the decision made at the surface. This is exactly why so many debates about performance go absolutely nowhere. You have teams arguing back and forth about the quality of the work, when in reality, they're all just feeling the downstream effects of a decision that was never explicitly made or owned. The struggle you're seeing isn't a sign of poor work. It's a symptom of structural ambiguity. And that ambiguity, well, it has a very real, very high cost. So let's talk about what happens when these foundational decision points are left undefined. When your decision surfaces are unclear, you create a direct, predictable path from internal confusion to external instability. It's almost guaranteed. The first thing you get is conflicting ownership. When a decision surface isn't clearly defined and nobody explicitly owns it, well, then everybody thinks they own it. Marketing makes one choice, sales makes a competing one, and finance is operating on a totally different assumption, all for the exact same foundational decision. This, of course, leads to the next level of dysfunction: silent overrides. One person makes a decision with the best of intentions, but then it's quietly reversed or just ignored by someone else operating under a different set of rules. This isn't malicious behavior. It's the natural, unavoidable result of a system that has no clear architecture. And the final result of all of this? Revenue instability. The volatility you see in your outcomes is a direct reflection of the conflict happening at these hidden decision surfaces. It's not happening because people disagree. It's happening because the system lacks the structural clarity to protect a good decision from being overwritten. Now, when faced with all this chaos, the common instinct is to go buy a tool. We think a tool will enforce a process and bring order, but this approach almost always backfires. It creates what you could call the tool failure loop. You start with an unclear decision. You buy a tool to enforce a process, but the tool can't create clarity. It just automates and amplifies the ambiguity that's already there. So now, when the system breaks, it breaks faster, louder, and at a much greater scale. So let this be the key takeaway. If you cannot name, locate, and define the core decision surfaces in your business, then you don't truly understand your revenue system. You're just managing its downstream effects. Trying to act without this clarity is simply a recipe for instability. In our next explainer, we're going to build on this idea and explore exactly why tools so often fail to create leverage, and we'll uncover the one condition under which they can finally succeed.